It's the best-known police station in the world. But hidden away behind the glass walls of London's crime headquarters is a place known to very few. Imagine, if you like, a mausoleum of crime, a temple of wickedness, a shrine dedicated to the very worst that human beings are capable of. Up till now, you've had to imagine it because it's not open to the public. The grim nature of the exhibits means that it's barred from public view. Now we can open the door of Scotland Yard's Museum of Crime, also known as the Black Museum. In the Second World War, gas masks like this one were issued to civilians in case the Nazis resorted to chemical warfare. Mercifully, they were never needed. Except by one man who was merciless in his pursuit of money. He was a man with a horror of dirt. He'd always wear gloves, and this apron in particular, to protect his suit against the splashes of his dissolving victims.
The case Sir John George Haigh is probably the most bizarre event in Scotland Yard's history.
Haigh hadn't had a distinguished war. He spent much of it in prison as a convicted conman. Later he'd claimed that a car accident caused his morbid obsession with blood. He'd drink that of his victims. But Haigh wasn't mad. He was utterly logical in his mercenary motive, chillingly methodical in the way he disposed of his victims.
He was very devious. He was intent on having an easy life. He wanted to raise money in the easiest way that he could, and he was prepared to go to any lengths to do it. Haigh's first killing was in 1944. The first victim that came into his net was a friend of his named William McSwan. McSwan was lured down into a basement near the Gloucester Road, and he was killed with an iron bar across the head.
Months later, the dapper and handsome Haigh would kill again. This time, the parents of William McSwan. Haigh had worked for the family. He knew all about their valuable portfolio of post-war property investments.
Seems a bit bizarre that he should wipe out a whole family, but in fact he had a motive for that. He was after their properties. They owned 6 properties in London, and Haigh forged documents and signatures that gave him the ownership of all those 6 properties, which he turned into cash.
Haigh had made some £7,000, but by 1948 he'd blown it all. He met a couple called Rose and Archie Henderson, who befriended him. Haigh repaid friendship with murder. He lured the couple to his workshop and killed them with Henderson's own service revolver.
All their personal possessions he managed to acquire in his own name, and I think he raised about £6,000 in all, which he spent in a single year on good living in and around London. And then in the year 1949, he was broke again and was looking for victim number 6, who was Mrs. Olive Durand-Deacon, a lady he had met while he was a guest at the Onslow Court Hotel in London.
Like the Hendersons, Olive Deacon was invited to the workshop. Like them, shot in the back of the head. In all, 6 murders and £15,000 raised. And no one the wiser, Haigh believed, because of the fail-safe way he'd destroyed the body of evidence.
He would take the dead body, he would strip of its clothes, he would bind the arms around the body and insert the body into a 45-gallon oil drum. The acid would bubble up, the drum would get very hot, and the reaction between the body and the acid would be very fierce indeed. So fierce, the whole body would be turned into a black sludge within a matter of 24 to 48 hours.
The police learnt that Haigh had met Deacon on that fateful day, and they raided the chamber of horrors that was his workshop. Of the missing person, there was no obvious trace. But they did find the macabre paraphernalia of the man who was to go down in history as the acid bath murderer.
And the apron in the museum is It's marked with the yellow lines you can see around it, and that was to distinguish by the forensic people to distinguish body fat. And there was the gas mask, because the sulfuric acid gave off fumes. So he wore the gas mask and the gloves that he wore to protect himself whilst putting the bodies in, taking the remains out, skimming off the body fat, which, you know, doesn't dissolve in acid, and that had to be skimmed off and then disposed of separately.
But Haig's recipe for murder overlooked one critical ingredient: the fact that even in the most sulphurous of bubbling cauldrons, the newfangled product, plastic, didn't dissolve.
Now, when police officers went to the scene eventually and turned out the oil drum, this red plastic handbag is at the bottom. The body's gone. The body is disintegrated, but there's wonderful evidence of who the person was that had died in there.
Haig thought he couldn't be convicted if there was no body. But parts of Mrs. Deacon, albeit artificial ones, had survived to indict him from beyond the acid bath. Somehow it took the jury 17 minutes to reach its verdict. On the 10th of August 1949, Haig was given the last rites. A white cotton hood was placed over his head and a rope around his neck.
John Haig was a man without conscience. It was almost as if a surgeon had taken his conscience out with a scalpel so that he could face the world without any conscience. He did actually get away with it. He did kill 6 people, and he very nearly earned himself the fortune that he was yearning.
The Crime Museum is more than just a journey into criminal nostalgia. It exists to teach today's policemen about the ingenuity of the criminal mind. Take the case of the Kray gang. This case, in fact, a smart gentleman's briefcase, but one designed for murder. The sort of case Q might have dreamt up for 007, but which belonged to a family which had the arrogance to believe it needed no license to kill.
This was one of the most extraordinary and bizarre episodes, really, in British, I was going to say, criminal history. And I mean, there have been some fairly bizarre episodes, but this more or less takes the biscuit.
By the mid-60s, time was running out for the gang that ruled the East End of swinging London. The police had the gang firmly in its sights. The Krays had built their empire on terror. People knew they were doomed if they gave information to the police or evidence in court. To underline that menace, the Krays planned to execute a witness on the very steps of the Central Criminal Court.
As a favour to another criminal, the Krays organised the making of a suitcase which had a hypodermic syringe in it, which they were going to take to the Old Bailey and stab the victim in the leg, who was presumably then going to die sort of frothing at the mouth on the spot. It was going to be obviously sensational, you know, killing at the Old Bailey. I mean, it's the sort of Agatha Christie stuff.
Triggering the briefcase mechanism would deliver a lethal needleful of poison.
On the back wall was fixed a hypodermic syringe, and from that came a wire that came across the suitcase that came out of a small hole. It was out of the small hole, outside and just underneath where the handle is. Now, when that is pulled, out of the side of the case comes the hypodermic needle, which was used to inject cyanide into people to kill them. That was the idea.
It was a plan which illustrated both the brilliant ingenuity and the boneheaded incompetence of the criminal mind.
The thing never worked. The man who was deputed to carry the suitcase and do the stabbing couldn't actually work out who the man was he was meant to be killing. And there were another couple of efforts at that, and eventually the whole thing was abandoned. I think the suitcase was unique in gangland history. I certainly can't recall of a suitcase with a poisoned syringe in it. It was completely out of the ordinary.
Behind the doors of the Crime Museum, there are less elaborate weapons of murder. And behind those weapons lie tangled tales of passion, rejection, and revenge. In Part 2, the gun that fired the shots that led to Britain's last female hanging. And the knife that sparked a moral panic in the 20s. and the lethal evidence from the brain of a deceived husband shot to death. Romance and revenge have always kept close company. The Crimson Crime of Passion has a special section among the showcases of the Crime Museum. This gun was at the heart of one of the most tragic murder cases of the 1950s. A murder that would ultimately claim the lives of two lovers, a flash, fast-living racing driver and the woman he wronged.
Ruth Ellis was a hostess, a club manageress, and a part-time prostitute. She had married Mr. Ellis, an alcoholic dentist, who beat her on occasion, so she didn't really have a very happy life.
Ruth was working as a hostess in London's Soho nightclubs when she met David Blakely. It was a meeting of two iconic 50s stereotypes, the platinum floozy and the rotter.
Ruth fell for him like a ton of bricks, and they had an on and off relationship for quite a while. There were rows, they hit each other. It was very much an up and down relationship. And in the end, David Blakely, I think, decided that he'd had enough, and he went to ground.
Blakely used to beat Ruth, giving her a black eye and a broken ankle. When she heard that he was with another woman, Ruth Ellis decided to be no longer a victim, but an avenger. At the Magdala pub in North London, Blakely was entertaining his girlfriend. Ruth Ellis took a taxi and took the gun.
On this Easter day, she turned up at the Magdala public house, waited till he came out of the off-licence and called his name. He ignored her, totally ignored her. And so she took out the gun and shot him. He then ran, so she fired again. He fell to the ground. She then walked up to him and emptied all the rest of the bullets into him while he was on the ground.
At trial, Ruth Ellis was asked, "When you fired that revolver, what did you intend to do?" She replied, "It's obvious. I intended to kill him."
The gun is a large gun in female terms. A lot of people would have expected a smaller gun, but it is quite a large gun. You know, where does a lady like that get a gun from?
It's now believed that the woman who pulled the trigger of this gun had only days earlier suffered a miscarriage, and that she'd been terribly abused as a child. But the jury only saw an impassive, unrepentant young woman who knew she had nothing to live for. She never appealed. On a July morning in 1955, she was given a glass of brandy and became the last woman in Britain to be hanged.
Ruth Ellis, who of course had a death wish. She'd killed the only thing she ever loved, and she wanted to die, and it was granted to her.
Revenge, traditionally, is not only sweet, it's also a dish best eaten cold. Another exhibit in the bleak showcases of the Crime Museum shows that you can also drink a cup of cold revenge. This is a loving cup. It dates from the early 19th century. There's more than one account of the provenance of this silver-rimmed antique relic, but this is the story they tell at the Yard.
There was a young girl in London in service. She was a chambermaid in a rich house, and she was made pregnant by the son of the household. Now, in those days, of course, there was no question of looking after her or paying for the baby or anything like that. She was just dismissed and kicked out on the streets. The girl had no money, she had no family, and she had to take to prostitution to survive. 30 years later, she is now the madam running a brothel in London, when into her brothel walked the man who had done her wrong all those years previously. Now, he didn't recognise her, she'd be one of many, but she recognised him. And she took her revenge and she murdered him in the brothel. having murdered him, she then went into the workshop outside, took a saw, and she cut his head in half. And this loving cup is half of this guy's skull. Apparently, she always used to say it was wonderfully sweet to be able to taste your revenge every time we had a drink.
A museum exhibit from the 1920s evokes an era when a death sentence owed much to a moral panic over a tale of sex in the suburbs and a fatal multiple stabbing. It was the story of Edith Thompson, her husband Percy, and a sailor. His name was Freddie Bywaters.
Edith and Percy Thompson were, I suppose, a lower middle-class couple. Both had reasonable jobs. They could afford to go out to the theatre. They bought themselves a nice little house in Ilford. Everything looked as though it was going to be quite rosy. And then they went on holiday to the Isle of Wight in 1921, taking with them Avis, who was Edith's sister, and Freddie Bywaters, who was Avis's boyfriend. At some time during the holiday, Thompson and Bywaters claimed that they fell in love.
All the nice girls,
Edith became infatuated with her younger lover.
girls love a time.
But Freddie was away at sea most of the year, so she poured her passion into a torrent of lovelorn letters.
Sailors are bright.
In these letters, Edith poured out her heart to Freddie. She used to say that she was talking to him, and she would write 15 or 16 pages of letter.
Ship ahoy, ship ahoy.
In the course of these letters, there are quite a few extracts which indicate that she was trying to persuade Freddie Bywaters to do something about Percy.
The romantic fantasy of a love-struck letter writer, or a cold invitation to kill. Whatever the motive, the letters had an effect. One night in October 1922, Edith and her husband were coming home after a night out at the theatre.
And they were walking back from Ilford Station when somebody bumped into Edith and pushed her against the wall. There was a scuffle, and Percy Thompson fell to the floor, and the man rushed off. Man, of course, was Freddie Bywaters. Percy Thompson had been stabbed 17 times. The last 3 were the dangerous ones, and the final one was the one that killed Percy Thompson.
It didn't take the police long to reconstruct the bloody and shattered pieces of this love triangle. The erotic language of those letters was to prove as fatal as any knife.
About 2/3 of Edith's letters were read out in court. And this was 1922, and we think differently these days about this sort of thing. But that was high scandal in those days. And all the very intimate things that Edith had put into her letters came out in court. The jury obviously were very much struck by this illicit romance that was going on between herself and a young man 8 years younger than she was.
Infidelity, a younger man, what the shocked judge called a vulgar common crime, that alone would have been enough for the jury. But there was also that knife.
The knife is an ordinary double-bladed knife. It's about 9 inches long, a double-sided blade coming to a point, with a handle of black, like diamond ridges. And this is the knife that Freddie Bywaters plunged into the neck of Percy Thompson to kill him, but was also used to stab him several times as well, lacerate his face, lacerate his chest, and then plunged into his neck. And this was the knife that Percy Thompson died with.
I had quite a lot of sympathy for Freddie Bywaters until I saw that dagger for the first time. And I realised that it's not the sort of knife that you buy to whittle wood with. It's just a killing instrument. That's about the only use you can say that that dagger is. And so that rather changed my views on Freddie Bywaters. He wasn't quite as naive as I thought he was.
The lovers were united in death, Edith hanged in Holloway. At the same moment, Percy fell through the trapdoor a mile away in Pentonville. The museum's next exhibit tells a moral story too, about the perils of the demon drink. If Percy Casserly hadn't been incapacitated by alcohol, his wife might not have sought the pleasure of another man's company, and his own life might not have come to an explosive and premature end.
Percy Casserly was an alcoholic. He worked for a brewery, and so I suppose he had access to the product. He'd married a girl, Ina, 24 years younger than he was, and with his alcoholism, it obviously wasn't a very happy marriage.
We'll have a barrel of fun.
In search of comfort outside the marriage, Ina Casserly didn't have to look far.
The blues on the run.
Ina met a builder's foreman, Ted Chaplin, who was working on property next door. Ted was more her age and virile, so virile in fact that he made her pregnant.
As soon as Ina found out, she told her husband, who was in hospital at the time, and asked for a divorce. Percy refused. Some time later, Ted determined to bring matters to a head.
One evening, Ted Chaplin came round to the Casserly's house and demanded to see Percy, and announced that he was responsible for Mrs. Casserly being pregnant, and they wanted a divorce. Ted Chaplin's story is that Percy Casserly refused and pulled a gun, and there was a struggle. And a shot was fired, and it went through Casserly's neck. It was only a flesh wound and not in any way fatal. The fight continued, and there was another explosion, and this time Percy Casserly slumped to the floor, not dead, but dying, shot in the head.
This second shot was fatal. Chaplin was arrested and charged with Casserly's murder. At his Old Bailey trial, he claimed that the shooting was in self-defense. The prosecution said it was a deliberate and calculated act of murder. And to buttress their case, they enlisted the aid of the fledgling science of forensic medicine. And they called this silent witness the brain of Percy Casserly.
The interesting thing about it is the black stick going through the brain, and that was put in there by a very, very famous pathologist of the day called Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury put the stick in to show the path of the bullet through the brain. Chaplin always claimed that it was an accident. He claimed he'd gone to talk to Casserly about money, and they'd rowed, and during the course of the row, Casserly had got the gun out of the desk and pointed it at Chaplin. Chaplin said, I just rushed forward and grappled with him and fought with him to stop him shooting me. And whilst we fought, the gun went off accidentally. Total accident. But Spilsbury proved that to get that angle through the brain, the gun had to be held by somebody standing at least 10 feet away. The guy was on the other side of the room when he shot him, not in a close quarter fight. So it totally disproved this man's story and proved he was lying.
But although the brain may have been a compelling piece of evidence, the jury were less convinced. Ted Chaplin was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter, and instead of facing the hangman's rope, he served only 8 years. On the day of his release, the woman he'd made pregnant, the woman whose husband he'd shot and killed, was waiting for him.
He was released at 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 hours after his release from prison, Edward Chaplin married Mrs. Casserly. And it was very profitable for him. Because Edward Chaplin was a builder's labourer, didn't have too much money. Casserly was a director of Wantley's Brewery, big house in Wimbledon, loads of money, came out and married the wife who had inherited everything. And so Chaplin moved into the big house and lived for the rest of his life as a very rich man on the man's money, which crime, of course, does pay sometimes.
Money's at the root of many a murder. In Part 3, we examine one of the museum's grimmest exhibits, the equipment used by the Black Panther as he carried out a lethal kidnap. And we examine the career of one of Britain's most notorious killers, the tenant of 10 Rillington Place. Some exhibits in the museum are for the curious, others to remind you of the sheer cruelty of crime. In 1975, in a small village in Shropshire, a young girl was abducted from her bed in the middle of the night. For the next 6 weeks, everyone waited to know if Leslie Whittle would be released unharmed by the man who wore this trademark balaclava, the Black Panther.
Well, there was a definite aura of fear and apprehension in the area, because it was felt that as this kidnapper had crept into an isolated house in a village and then spirited away the lovely daughter, that anything was possible for him. Children were obviously a bit frightened by it all, and my daughter, for instance, hid behind the settee when there was any strange noise in the house. It had that effect, and she was 14 at the time.
When a 17-year-old could simply be stolen from her bed, was anyone safe?
She was snatched naked from her bedroom. She slept in the nude, and all she had on was a dressing gown and a pair of slippers.
Leslie was thrown into a car and, wearing nothing more substantial than a flimsy dressing gown and that pair of slippers, was driven 40 miles to the terrible place which her abductor had chosen for her prison. Her kidnapper was Donald Neilson, known as the Black Panther. Neilson knew of a water pumping station at Bathpool Park in Staffordshire. Deep in a drainage shaft was the dungeon where he'd hide his terrified captive while he waited for the ransom money.
The drain is not a conventional drain. There are ledges there where people can sit or stand while they're doing their work. It is a damp, dark, horrible place.
Leslie Whittle was left to endure the pitch darkness and January's icy dampness, secured to a ledge and with only a cheap sleeping bag for comfort. While she lay helpless deep underground, Neilson pursued his ransom demands.
Well, he left a dymo tape in the Whittle household after he'd crept in through the garage door, and it said, no police, otherwise there will be death. That was a death threat. It asked for a comparably modest sum of £50,000, but it said it should be in used notes, and it should be deposited at a rendezvous which he would make known later on.
Almost 8 weeks later, in early March, the police discovered Leslie Whittle's body. It was suspended from the ledge, hanging from a wire. The cause of death was not what first it seemed.
The most horrendous thing of this was that Leslie Whittle, whilst hanging down the shaft, didn't die of strangulation. She died of something called vagal inhibition. That is an attack of the central nervous system. She died of fright. She died of shock. And of course, you can die of fright. You can die of shock. I just find it absolutely horrendous that this poor kid actually died in that way.
It was to take the police 9 months before they caught up with the Black Panther, Donald Neilson. Among the Black Museum's darkest exhibits are the relics of Neilson's record of violent crime.
The wires that actually were found on Leslie Whittle when she was found dead. Crossbows that he used for robberies and burglaries. The balaclavas that he wore, Black Panther, he always wore black.
Neilson claimed he'd never meant Leslie to die, but he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life, with the recommendation that he should never be released. He will die in his jail, just as he made his victim die in hers.
When Leslie's background was probed, it was found that she was as pure as a driven snow, just a straightforward student who'd done nothing at all wrong and nothing to deserve this fate.
For years, a 19th century villain eluded the police. The forensic techniques which catch today's killers grew from the hunt for Charlie Peace.
Charlie Peace was a cat burglar, respectable by day and the scourge of the police for a good 4 years in the middle of the 19th century. He was an ugly little man, only about 5'4". He'd broken his jaw in an accident which gave him a rather peculiar appearance. He walked with a bad limp due to an industrial accident when he was a lad, and he had a finger missing off his left hand, despite which he played the violin so well that when he gave local concerts, they billed him as the modern-day Paganini.
Off stage, Paganini Peace's criminal career spanned the country. Before the days of photo fits and fingerprints, he could travel the country without fear of identification. There was little or no communication between police forces, so this stunted, seven-fingered man with a limp and a broken jaw could kill a policeman in Manchester and then cross the Pennines to murder a jealous husband in Sheffield. And there was no one to put two and two together and make peace.
He had to leave the Sheffield area immediately. Eventually he made his way down to London, taking with him his wife and later on his mistress, and all three of them lived in the same house together alongside a child that had been born to the mistress, so it was a very peculiar household.
Charlie had got away with 2 murders and went back to some honest burglary, until fate caught up with him.
He did a burglary in Blackheath and he was disturbed by P.C. Robinson. He then shot P.C. Robinson 5 times, but the P.C. actually survived, and he was eventually arrested and charged with the attempted murder of this police officer.
Peace's violin case aroused the police's suspicions. Even the dullest of Victorian constables knew that violins weren't supposed to rattle.
He would take out the violin and put in the jemmies, the gimlets, into the violin case, knowing full well that he was less likely to be stopped by a policeman at night carrying a violin case than if he was carrying a bag with swaggering on it.
Among the tools of his trade, Charlie Peace's patent collapsible cat burgling ladder.
Series of pieces of wood, probably about 2 feet by 4 inches long, which overlapped, so that one just slightly overlapped the other, and there was a bolt with a nut on going through. Now those things, of course, would swivel round, but the ladder, when it extended, came all the way down, which left a ridge between the 2 pieces of wood. And Charlie Peace would go to the top of Victorian houses, which, of course, were flat-top roofs. He would go over the top of the roofs, he would drop the ladder down, secure it, and then step down, stepping on the ridges to the upstairs bedroom, breaking through the window, burgle the house, came back up, shin up the ladder, pull it back up, and away over the top again. A really quite ingenious thing.
To catch future Charlies, the police matched ingenuity with invention. They measured criminals' arms, legs, hands, and sent the data from force to force. But Charlie's case was still not closed.
When he was charged, the lady he was living with, could see she wasn't going to see him for a long time, and there was a reward of £100. So soon afterwards, she went in to the police and said he's wanted for murder.
The murder of the Sheffield husband and the Manchester policeman, for which Peace watched 2 innocent men convicted, finally caught up with him. And so did the hangman. "10 Rillington Place. An address that will live forever in the annals of murder. Like the name of John Christie, the relics of his victims preserved at the museum. In 1952, police were called to a house in Notting Hill Gate. A new tenant had made an alarming discovery.
Was knocking on the walls to try and find a suitable place for the shelf when he realised that the wall was hollow. Peeling off the wallpaper, he looked through, and to his horror, he saw the naked body of a woman. In fact, when the police came, they found 3 women, all walled up in the cupboard. And on further searching the premises, they found the body of Mrs. Christie, wrapped in blankets under the floorboards. There were altogether the remains of 8 women found at Rillington Place.
Some of them were found in the garden.
The bodies inside the house, relatively easy to identify, but the 2 in the garden did cause a problem, because all there was was a bit of bone, a bit of skeleton and things like that. And that could be difficult to identify. It's actually a lot easier for us today because forensic science has improved so much. You know, in today's world, give a bone to a forensic scientist, they'll practically tell you there the week that it was put in the ground. But science wasn't as good as that, you know, in 1952.
But eventually the science of horticulture, this tree root, this piece of backbone, gave the police a lead.
Now, if you look carefully, right at the back, you can see a human vertebrae, a backbone, and the root is actually growing through the vertebrae. Now, the point about this is, whose vertebrae was that? If the police officers knew how long the body had been in the ground, that would give them some idea where to start looking through the person's missing reports, wouldn't it? To try and identify these people. Shrub roots will grow at a predetermined rate. Police at the time were told by the experts it would take 9 years to go through that.
And the scene of crime officers were soon to find other clues among the geraniums.
Also, in the back garden of Rillington Place, police found other pieces of vertebrae, which you see here in this box. And also they found the skull. This skull, again, you see here. Now, this skull was Christie had smashed with a sledgehammer into lots of little pieces. Police officers collected the pieces together, put them in a box, gave them to the pathologist, in this case a man called Francis Camps, and Francis Camps rebuilt the skull to find that it was a female skull. In the skull there's a jawbone, in the jawbone there are teeth, and in the teeth there are fillings. Now, the fillings in the teeth were interesting because they were an amalgam of mercury and silver. And there was only one country in Europe that used a pure mercury-silver amalgam, and that was Germany. And when you look through the person's missing reports for 1943, living 2 streets away from John Christie, but a young girl he knew who had gone missing at that time, a young Austrian girl called Ruth First. Murdered in 1943, but then dug up and identified in 1952.
For the murder of Ruth First, his wife, and 6 other women, Christie was sentenced to death. He was hanged. In the final part of our journey through this secret museum, 2 exhibits which show the sacrifice and courage of police officers. The attempted kidnapping of Princess Anne, and the officer who died in the case of Kray and Bentley. Unseen by the public at Scotland Yard's closed Museum of Crime is evidence of a crime which nearly claimed the life of a senior member of the royal family. In March 1974, Princess Anne was being driven back to Buckingham Palace after an official engagement. Her car was about to be halted by a would-be kidnapper called Ian Ball. Earlier that day, the Queen had been sent this letter, a ransom demand for her daughter. The price on her head, £3 million. Ball also made it clear what fate would befall the princess if his demands weren't met. Early that evening, Ball lay in wait in his car at the end of the Mall. Technically, what he was plotting was treason, an attempt on the person of the sovereign's daughter. At the same time, a taxi full of journalists on a night out was bowling merrily along the Mall.
I was travelling from Fleet Street to the Irish Club in Eaton Square, Belgravia. First thing I heard was wrong was the sound of gunshots.
His journalistic instinct stronger than that of self-preservation, Brian McConnell leapt from the car and found himself face to face with a princess, a madman, and the scoop of his life.
I saw the princess through the glass of the car. She was trying to get into the car, trying to persuade her to leave it. She was hanging on to the car so she didn't have to leave it, and was presumably telling the man to go away. What happened next? People say, well, it was a gunshot. So I said, well, I'm not shot very often, but it's like an enormous punch in the region of the heart, this was. And I was sort of slightly breathless, lost my breath for a moment, and probably discretion was the better part to retreat behind the car and make for the shelter of the trees.
Brian McConnell wasn't the only person to be shot that night. The Royal Protection Officer sitting next to the driver of the Royal Daimler was hit. But the man who had the closest shave with death was a patrolling bobby who heard the gunfire and rushed to the scene.
It's a uniform jacket worn by PC Michael Hills, who was one of the first uniform officers on the scene. And Ian Ball, of course, shot Michael Hills. The other very, very interesting part is the little diary that Michael Hills had in his top uniform jacket. Now, if you look at this, you can see where the bullet went through the diary. Now, the medical people at the time said that, in all probability, saved his life. If it hadn't been for that diary, it quite possibly would have killed him. That is the actual diary you're looking at, with the bullet hole through, that saved this officer's life.
Ball is still in custody. Prince Philip is said to have remarked that if he'd succeeded, his daughter would have given him a hell of a time. Since the creation of the Metropolitan Police, 63 officers have been killed in the line of duty. In the Museum of Crime, there's a special area dedicated to these officers. Among these exhibits are those associated with the case of Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig. In 1952, Britain was finally on the road to recovery after the stress and sacrifice of the Second World War. But there were worries about the peacetime generation. Young people lacked discipline, values, and moral fibre.
There was already concern in the newspapers about how violent crime was going to become part of the British way of life. A lot of people had guns following the war, brought service revolvers back with them, and this crime tapped into a national feeling of fear and anxiety. And I think the murder of a policeman at that time was an extremely rare event and very, very worrying.
The murder of PC Sidney Miles, with this weapon on that fateful night, began with the innocuous bus journey of two teenage boys.
Derek Bentley, who was then aged 19, was at home with his family when his friend Christopher Craig, who was 3 years younger than him, knocked on the door. The two boys took the bus into Croydon. Derek had no idea what they were going to do. The idea was to just go and hang around the town. Christopher Craig had brought a gun with him. Derek never knew that. Although Craig did give Derek a knuckle duster while they were on the bus together. When they got to Croydon, they hung around a bit, then decided to there and then, I think on the spur of the moment, to break into the warehouse on Tamworth Road. They climbed onto the roof, but they were spotted by a woman living opposite who rang the police, and the police arrived very quickly. The police then surrounded the warehouse and climbed onto the roof. After being chased around a chimney stack, he was apprehended by one of the police officers, arrested, and waited quietly with him. Meanwhile, Christopher Craig had produced a gun. Christopher Craig shot at Sidney Miles as he came out of a door onto the roof, hit him between the eyes and killed him.
It was Craig who had fired the shot. Bentley was in police hands when the gun was fired. Could Derek Bentley, in all justice, be held responsible? The weapons the two young men carried that night certainly influenced the court.
In the museum, we have the gun, this .45 Colt with a sawn-off barrel. We have the knife that he had on his possession. We have the knife that Derek Bentley had on him, and the knuckle duster that Derek Bentley had on him in his possession. Well, the knuckle duster is a standard knuckle duster. It's a thing that your hand goes through like an oval shape, and then it wraps around the knuckles, and so you hit when you're holding it in the hand, and your knuckles are now metal, of course, when you can hit somebody. The only thing with this difference with this one, at the end, there was a spike sticking out. So it was quite a horrendous looking thing, because you could either hit somebody with that or rip them or tear their flesh with the spike that stuck out if you turned it the other way. And that was, of course, the thing that the judge in the case commented upon, which, you know, have you ever turned to the jury and said, have you ever seen a more horrible, disgusting weapon than this, you know? Judge said at the time to the jury, which was a bit over the top.
Christopher Craig was too young to be executed for the fatal shot he'd fired. He served a prison sentence and was eventually freed. Derek Bentley was shown no such mercy by the trial judge, Lord Goddard, who, after summing up now notorious for its lack of fairness, sentenced him to hang. For the next 40 years, his family fought to clear his name.
In 1991, there was an application for a pardon which was refused, and after a judicial review, he was granted a pardon limited as to sentence, which is like saying, we're sorry we hanged you, but we think you're still guilty.
Finally, the new Criminal Cases Review Commission sent the case of Derek Bentley back to the Court of Appeal.
The Court of Appeal decided that his conviction should be overturned, because I think their words were, he was denied the fair trial, which is the birthright of every British citizen. The fact was, he didn't have a fair trial, and therefore his conviction was unfair. So he's entitled to be treated as an innocent man.
2 lives lost for nothing. Most museums commemorate the past, like the case of Derek Bentley. But inevitably, the future has more grim exhibits in store for the showcases behind the closed doors at the Yard.